The camera pans over the snow-covered streets of Chicago, lit by flickering streetlights and the glow of distant skyscrapers. A slow zoom reveals a luxurious penthouse at the top of one of the city's tallest buildings. Inside, a man sits alone at a grand desk, his expression cold, detached, until a knock at the door breaks the silence that he hesitates, then opens it to find a plain brown package, no name, no address. Back at his desk, he tears it open, revealing an old manuscript and a letter. His eyes widen as he reads the words, "You promised me you'd never forget." The camera lingers on his trembling hands, the weight of the past crashing into the present. Who sent this? What promise did he break? And why now, on the eve of a new year? Before we uncover this haunting tale of broken promises and redemption, make sure to hit subscribe. This is just the beginning of a story that will leave you questioning what matters most in life. Let's dive in. Chicago lay under a thick blanket of snow, its streets glittering under the festive glow of Christmas lights. The bustling sounds of the season, a mix of car horns, footsteps crunching on icy sidewalks, and cheerful carols, were muffled by the cold, crisp air. High above the city, on the penthouse floor of a towering skyscraper, Arturo glanced out at the sprawling skyline. The Lake Michigan shoreline shimmered in the distance, its frozen surface catching the reflections of holiday fireworks from the parks below. The view was breathtaking, but Arturo barely noticed the penthouse was a testament to his success. Polished marble floors gleamed under the light of a chandelier that had been imported from Italy. Shelves filled with first editions lined the walls, not for love of literature, but to impress visitors. A sleek fireplace cast a warm, golden glow over the space, though Arturo sat at his massive oak desk, untouched by the warmth. His tailored suit was immaculate, as always, and his silver watch glinted in the dim light. Arturo De Luca, founder and CEO of De Luca Publishing, was a man whose reputation preceded him. Admired for his brilliance but feared for his temper, he had built an empire by spotting literary gold where others saw only coal. Yet his success had come at a cost. To those who worked for him, Arturo was a tyrant, a man who crushed dreams as easily as he crushed poor manuscripts under his polished shoes. His phone buzzed on the desk. It was a reminder about the company's annual Christmas Eve Gala, a glittering event held in the grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel. Arturo hated these gatherings but attended out of obligation. They were a chance for the press to fawn over him and for his employees to bask in his rare presence, though he usually left long before the clock struck midnight. That he dismissed the notification with a flick of his finger and turned his attention back to the manuscript he had been reviewing. Arturo's scowl deepened as he read the lines of prose. Another cliched story of redemption, hope, and the so-called magic of the holidays. He scribbled a curt rejection on the cover page and shoved it aside. The doorbell rang, breaking his concentration. Arturo glanced at the clock. Who could be visiting him now, on Christmas Eve? He walked to the door, his polished leather shoes clicking against the marble floor. A small package rested on the mat, wrapped plainly in brown paper, with no name or address to identify the sender. Arturo hesitated, frowning, before picking it up. The weight was unremarkable, but something about its simplicity struck him as odd. Returning to his desk, Arturo sat down and carefully opened the package. Inside was a manuscript, its pages slightly yellowed as if it had been kept for years. The title, A Promise Lost, was written in an elegant hand on the first page. Beneath the title was a name he hadn't seen in decades, Michael Hayes. Arturo's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the name, feeling a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Memories, buried deep and long ignored, stirred uneasily. Michael Hayes. The boy who had been his best friend, his confidant, his co-conspirator in dreams of changing the world through stories. The boy who had died far too young. Alongside the manuscript was a folded letter. Arturo hesitated before picking it up, his fingers trembling slightly. He unfolded the paper and began to read. Dear Arturo, if you are reading this, it means I never found the courage to send it to you in life. This manuscript was my greatest work, my heart and soul poured onto paper. You promised me once that you would help bring my words to the world. I hope, even after all these years, that promise still means something to you. Merry Christmas, old friend." Michael Arturo sat back in his chair, the letter slipping from his hand. His chest tightened as a wave of guilt washed over him. He remembered that promise. They had been just boys, sitting under the shade of a tree in a summer long past, swapping stories and dreams. Michael had been so earnest, so passionate about his writing, and Arturo had been dazzled by his friend's talent. "When I grow up," Arturo had said, "I'll publish your book. I swear it." But Arturo hadn't kept his word. Life had pulled them in different directions. Michael had pursued writing, but Arturo, ever the pragmatist, had focused on building a business. They had drifted apart, their connection fading into a distant memory. And now, Michael was gone, and his words sat in Arturo's hands, a silent rebuke. The clock on the wall chimed the hour. Arturo blinked and realized he had been sitting in silence for nearly 20 minutes. The manuscript lay before him, and the weight of it felt heavier than anything he had carried in years. He reached out, almost reluctantly, and opened it to the first page. The opening lines were simple yet profound, speaking of faith, love, and the enduring power of kindness. Arturo read on, the words drawing him in despite himself. Michael's voice was there, clear and true, echoing across the years. For the first time in what felt like forever, Arturo felt a crack in the armor he had so carefully built around himself. He closed the manuscript after a few pages, leaning back in his chair. The grandiose life he had built, the empire of words that had made him a fortune, suddenly felt hollow. Outside, the city lights twinkled like scattered stars against the snowy backdrop. Arturo glanced at the clock again. The gala would be starting soon, but he didn't feel like celebrating. Instead, he looked at the manuscript once more. There was something there, something worth revisiting, not just in the pages, but in himself. The hours crept by in a silence that felt heavier than the usual solitude of Arturo's penthouse. The manuscript sat on his desk, its presence impossible to ignore, though Arturo tried to distract himself. He poured himself a glass of scotch, hoping the amber liquid would dull the unease that had settled in his chest. Yet, no matter how many times he glanced at the skyline or scrolled aimlessly on his phone, his eyes kept drifting back to the package and its contents. Michael Hayes. Arturo hadn't spoken his name aloud in decades. Now, it echoed in his mind as if no time had passed since their last conversation. That memory, still sharp and vivid, crept in uninvited. It had been a summer day, the kind of day when the world felt limitless. Arturo and Michael had sat cross-legged on the grass near the old oak tree in their hometown park. Between them lay a notebook filled with Michael's scribbled stories. Michael had been animated, gesturing wildly as he read excerpts of his latest tale. Arturo, always the critical eye even as a teenager, had offered suggestions and praise in equal measure. "When I grow up," Arturo had said, with the absolute certainty of youth, "I'll have a publishing company, and your stories will be the first I print." Michael had laughed, his eyes bright with excitement. "You better not forget that promise, Arturo," he had said, grinning. "I'm holding you to it." But promises made in youth are often fragile, and life's currents had swept them apart. Arturo had chosen ambition and practicality, trading his dreams of creativity for the pursuit of power. Michael, in contrast, had clung to his ideals, though they had come at a cost. Arturo had heard snippets over the years, of Michael's struggles, his attempts to get his work noticed, and eventually, his untimely death. The sound of his glass clinking against the desk broke Arturo's reverie. He hadn't thought of that day in years, but now the memory felt like an open wound. The manuscript was a reminder of a version of himself he had buried long ago, a version that believed in things like loyalty and artistry over profit margins. Arturo reached for the letter again, rereading Michael's words. They felt like a challenge, a reminder of a debt left unpaid. The guilt that had been simmering beneath the surface since he opened the package now rose like a tide, threatening to overwhelm him. Arturo wasn't used to this feeling. Guilt, regret, those were emotions he had learned to suppress, dismissing them as distractions that had no place in the life of a man like him. That he pushed back his chair abruptly, pacing the room as if he could outwalk the weight in his chest. The manuscript's title, A Promise Lost, felt almost mocking now. Arturo had no idea how Michael's words had ended up here, in his penthouse, so many years after his death. Who had sent them? And why now, on Christmas Eve of all nights? The questions buzzed in his mind, refusing to be silenced. Arturo was not a man who liked mysteries. He thrived on control, on having all the answers, but this package was an anomaly he couldn't explain. Finally, he returned to the desk, his fingers hesitating over the manuscript. He flipped through the pages with a careful touch, as if the brittle paper might crumble under his hands. The opening lines had already gripped him earlier, but now he read deeper, allowing the story to unfold. The tale was about a man named Samuel, a once kind and compassionate soul who had lost his way in the pursuit of wealth. Samuel's journey mirrored Arturo's in ways that felt uncomfortably close to home. As Samuel neglected his friends, abandoned his promises, and justified his selfishness in the name of success, Arturo felt as though the words were aimed directly at him, but the manuscript wasn't all darkness. Interwoven through Samuel's missteps were glimmers of hope, moments where the protagonist had a chance to make amends, to find redemption. Arturo read until the words blurred on the page, his eyes stinging from both fatigue and emotion. He hadn't expected to be so moved, but Michael's prose had a way of peeling back layers Arturo hadn't even realized were there. When Arturo finally closed the manuscript, it was well past midnight. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the story pressing down on him like a physical burden. It wasn't just the brilliance of Michael's writing that struck him, it was the undeniable truth within it. Arturo had become a man Samuel might have admired once, only to grow to despise later. He had built an empire on the dreams of others, but in doing so, he had forgotten the very people who had inspired him in the first place. Michael had been one of those people. The thought of attending the gala now felt almost absurd. How could he stand in front of his employees and colleagues, shaking hands and accepting praise, knowing the truth of who he was? Arturo glanced at his phone again, where another notification about the event blinked on the screen. He sighed heavily and dismissed it. Instead, he walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, staring out at the city below. Snow continued to fall, blanketing the streets and muffling the world in a peaceful quiet. Arturo felt anything but peaceful. The manuscript had ignited something inside him, something he couldn't quite name yet, a restlessness, a yearning for something beyond the life he had built. That he thought about Michael again, about the kind of man his friend had been. Michael had always been the optimist, the one who believed in the power of stories to change lives. Arturo had dismissed that optimism as naive, but now, as he stood alone in his penthouse, he wondered if Michael had been right all along. The city lights flickered below, and Arturo felt the weight of his decisions like never before. He turned back to the desk, his eyes landing on the manuscript one more time. Maybe it wasn't too late. Arturo sat in the silence of his penthouse, the weight of the manuscript pressing down on him like an anchor. The city outside his windows shimmered with holiday cheer, a spectacle of lights and decorations, but inside, the room was heavy with tension. The manuscript lay open on his desk, its pages yellowed and fragile, the words of a man long gone whispering truths Arturo wasn't ready to face. The opening lines had already stirred something deep within him. They spoke of small acts of kindness, a neighbor sharing food during a snowstorm, a stranger offering warmth on a cold night, and how those moments, though fleeting, could change the course of a life. Arturo didn't know why those words felt so personal, so pointed, but they did. He felt as though Michael were speaking directly to him across the years, asking questions he had spent a lifetime avoiding. With a steadying breath, Arturo turned to the next page. He read slowly, each sentence drawing him deeper into the story of Samuel, the protagonist. Samuel was a young man with humble beginnings, full of hope and generosity, whose life took a dark turn after an inheritance catapulted him into wealth. The sudden windfall transformed him, not through greed, but through a slow erosion of his values. Arturo could see himself in Samuel, a man who had started with good intentions but had allowed ambition to consume him. As he read on, Arturo felt the sting of recognition in every paragraph. Samuel's story unfolded like a mirror to his own life. The character had begun as a dreamer, someone who believed in the power of stories to inspire change. But with wealth came distractions, and with distractions came compromises. Samuel neglected friendships, discarded promises, and justified his growing indifference with the belief that success demanded sacrifice. Arturo's chest tightened as he turned another page. Michael's prose was raw and unflinching, his words cutting to the bone. There were moments in the story where Samuel's actions were so cold, so ruthless, that Arturo had to pause, unable to deny the parallels to his own decisions. One passage struck him particularly hard. It described a moment when Samuel was confronted by an old friend, someone he had promised to help but had abandoned instead. The friend pleaded with Samuel to remember who he had been, to rediscover the kindness and loyalty that once defined him. Samuel, blinded by pride and fear, dismissed the friend and moved on, only to realize too late that he had lost something irreplaceable. Arturo set the manuscript down, his hands trembling. He remembered Michael's words in the letter, "You promised me once that you would help bring my words to the world. I hope, even after all these years, that promise still means something to you." The memory of that promise, made so long ago, crashed over Arturo like a wave. He had meant it at the time. He truly had. But life had pulled him in another direction, and he had let that promise slip away, just as Samuel had done in the story. Now, Michael was gone, and Arturo was left holding the remnants of a friendship he had failed to honor. He stood abruptly, pacing the room as if movement could dispel the emotions swirling within him. The opulence of his penthouse, the symbols of his success, felt suffocating. The marble floors, the designer furniture, the art on the walls, all of it seemed meaningless in the face of Michael's words. Arturo glanced at the clock. It was late, but he knew the gala was still in full swing. He had promised his assistant he would make an appearance, but the thought of mingling with his employees, of pretending to celebrate, felt unbearable. How could he face them? Knowing the truth about himself, he returned to the desk, his eyes falling on the manuscript once more. There was something unfinished in the story, a thread that pulled at him, urging him to keep reading. He sat down and turned another page. The next chapter shifted to a moment of reckoning for Samuel. After years of selfishness and neglect, Samuel was forced to confront the consequences of his actions. He found himself alone on Christmas Eve, surrounded by wealth but devoid of connection. The scene was stark and haunting, a man trapped in the very life he had built for himself. Arturo's breath hitched. The description of Samuel's isolation felt uncomfortably familiar. The sprawling penthouse, the expensive scotch, the hollow success, it was as if Michael had seen into Arturo's future and written it down as a warning. As the chapter unfolded, Samuel stumbled upon an old notebook filled with the stories he had written in his youth. The discovery sparked a flood of memories, reminding him of the man he had been before ambition hardened his heart. Arturo felt a pang of recognition. He thought of his own past, of the nights he and Michael had spent dreaming of the future. They had shared so many ideas, so many plans for the kind of world they wanted to create through stories. Michael had believed in those dreams with an intensity that Arturo had admired, even envied. But Arturo had chosen a different path, one that prioritized profit over passion, and in doing so, he had lost something essential. Arturo closed the manuscript, unable to read further. The weight of his emotions was too much to bear. He stared out at the city lights, their brightness a stark contrast to the darkness he felt inside. For the first time in years, Arturo felt small, insignificant in the face of the memories and regrets that Michael's words had unearthed. The question that lingered was one Arturo couldn't yet answer: what now? The manuscript had opened a door he couldn't close, forcing him to confront the man he had become. But what could he do with that knowledge? Michael was gone, and the promises Arturo had made could never be fulfilled in the way he had once imagined. Yet, the manuscript was here. It had found its way to him, against all odds, as if Michael had orchestrated its arrival from beyond the grave. Arturo didn't believe in fate, but the timing was impossible to ignore. The phone buzzed on the desk, pulling Arturo from his thoughts. It was a message from his assistant, a reminder about the gala and a request for confirmation of his attendance. Arturo stared at the screen for a long moment before setting the phone down without answering. He looked at the manuscript one more time, running his fingers over the worn pages. Somewhere in those words, Arturo felt there was an answer, not just for Samuel, but for himself. Outside, the snow fell in thick, silent flakes, blanketing the city in a stillness that felt almost sacred. Arturo took a deep breath and resolved to finish the story. Perhaps Michael's words held the key to more than just his redemption. Perhaps they held the key to Arturo's own. The glow of dawn crept through the floor-to-ceiling windows, bathing Arturo's penthouse in a pale, muted light. He hadn't slept. The manuscript sat open on the desk before him, its pages worn but alive with the voice of a man he hadn't thought of in years. Arturo leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as the memories he had long buried clawed their way to the surface. Michael Hayes. The name hung in the air like a ghost, tethered to moments Arturo had tried to forget. Arturo had always been the one to forge ahead, to focus on the future rather than the past. Yet, here he was, unable to look away from the echoes of the boy who had once been his closest friend. They had met in elementary school, two boys drawn together by their love of stories. Michael had been a whirlwind of ideas, scribbling furiously in notebooks during recess and sharing his creations with anyone who would listen. Arturo, even then, had been practical. He had admired Michael's boundless creativity, but he had also been the one to offer structure, suggesting endings, tightening plots, and ensuring their stories made sense. It had been a perfect partnership, at least for a time. Together, they had dreamed of becoming great writers, of publishing books that would change the world. Michael had been the idealist, with his unwavering belief in the power of stories to heal, to inspire, to bring people together. Arturo had been the realist, focused on how they would make those dreams a reality, but as they grew older, their paths began to diverge. Arturo's practicality evolved into ambition, a hunger for success that drove him to pursue business school and internships at publishing houses. Michael, meanwhile, remained steadfast in his passion for writing, pouring his soul into stories that, to Arturo's growing frustration, seemed too idealistic, too impractical for the market. Arturo could still recall their last real conversation, though he had tried to forget it for years. They had been in their early 20s, sitting in a shabby diner in their hometown. Michael had been excited, talking animatedly about the manuscript he was working on, A Promise Lost. Arturo had listened, nodding at the right moments, but his mind had been elsewhere. "You don't seem interested," Michael had said suddenly, his tone a mixture of disappointment and hurt. "It's not that," Arturo had replied, though it wasn't entirely true. "I just think you need to think about what sells, Michael. Idealism is great, but you need a hook, something marketable." Michael had frowned, his enthusiasm dimming. "It's not about what sells, Arturo. It's about telling the truth. Stories should mean something. And how do you plan to tell those stories if no one publishes them?" Arturo had countered, his voice sharper than he intended. "The world isn't going to care about your ideals if you can't even get your work out there." Michael had fallen silent, his eyes searching Arturo's face for something that wasn't there. "You've changed," he had said softly. Arturo had brushed the comment aside, unwilling to acknowledge its sting. They had parted ways that day, and though they had kept in touch sporadically after that, their friendship was never the same. Arturo had been too busy climbing the corporate ladder, and Michael, ever the dreamer, had faded into the background of Arturo's increasingly ambitious life. Now, sitting in the quiet of his penthouse, Arturo felt the full weight of that moment. He had dismissed Michael's passion as naive, but now he could see the truth in his friend's words. Stories should mean something. Yet Arturo's own career had been built on the opposite principle, on profit, on marketability, on stripping stories of their heart to make them more palatable for the masses. The irony wasn't lost on him. Michael had died unknown, his work unpublished, while Arturo had become one of the most powerful figures in the publishing world. And yet, For all his success, Arturo felt hollow. The manuscripts he greenlit were lucrative but forgettable, and the empire he had built brought him no joy, only the shallow satisfaction of a quarterly earnings report. Arturo stood and began to pace, the memories swirling in his mind like a storm. He thought of the letter that had accompanied the manuscript, Michael's words, both a plea and a challenge. "You promised me once that you would help bring my words to the world." He remembered that promise vividly. They had been boys, sitting under the shade of a tree in the park, dreaming of their future. Arturo had sworn he would use his skills to make sure Michael's stories were published. At the time, it had been a vow made in innocence, a moment of pure belief in their shared dreams, but Arturo had failed to keep that promise. He had abandoned Michael, not out of malice, but out of a belief that his own path was more important. And now, years later, Michael's words had returned to haunt him, a reminder of the man Arturo might have been if he hadn't lost sight of what truly mattered. That he stopped pacing and turned back to the desk, staring at the manuscript. It wasn't just a story. It was Michael's heart and soul, a piece of him that had somehow survived the years and found its way back to Arturo. Arturo sat down and picked up the manuscript again, his hand steady this time. He began to read, not as an editor, but as a friend. The story unfolded with a beauty and depth that took his breath away. Michael's prose was raw, unflinching, but also filled with a quiet hope that lingered beneath the surface. The character of Samuel was flawed, painfully so, but there was a humanity to him that Arturo couldn't ignore. As he read, Arturo found himself rooting for Samuel, hoping he would find redemption, even as he saw shades of himself in the character's selfishness and regret. The sun climbed higher in the sky, but Arturo didn't notice. He read page after page, losing track of time as Michael's words transported him to another world. For the first time in years, Arturo felt something stir within him, a spark of the boy who had once believed in the power of stories, who had dared to dream of changing the world. When he finally reached the end of the chapter, Arturo leaned back in his chair, the weight in his chest both heavier and lighter at the same time. Michael had been right. Stories did mean something. And this story, a promise lost, was a gift, a reminder of the man Arturo had been, and the man he still could be. The question was, what would he do with it? The quiet hours of the morning stretched into the afternoon as Arturo remained in his penthouse, surrounded by the dim warmth of the fireplace and the steady fall of snow beyond the tall windows. He hadn't left his chair since finishing the last chapter of Michael's manuscript. It sat on the desk before him, its pages creased and worn, yet somehow more alive than anything Arturo had read in years. For a long time, he stared at it, his mind reeling with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. The manuscript had stripped away every layer of pretense, every excuse Arturo had crafted to justify the choices that had brought him here. Success, wealth, prestige, all of it felt meaningless in the face of what Michael had created. Arturo leaned forward, flipping back to the first page of the manuscript. His hand hovered over the title, A Promise Lost, written in Michael's elegant hand. The name was both haunting and painfully appropriate. Arturo felt as if Michael had seen through the years, writing not just a story but a prophecy, one that had come full circle to confront Arturo in this moment. His phone buzzed again, drawing his attention briefly. It was another notification about the gala. His assistant had sent a text, "The staff is asking if you'll be arriving soon. Should I let them know you're on your way?" Arturo sighed, setting the phone down without responding. The thought of attending the event felt almost absurd now. The glittering lights, the empty smiles, the insincere exchanges, it was all a performance, and Arturo was no longer in the mood to play his part. How could he? After reading Michael's words, he turned his attention back to the manuscript, opening it to a random page. The scene he found described Samuel, the protagonist, facing the fallout of his choices. He had alienated those closest to him, abandoned promises made in good faith, and justified his actions in the name of success. Now, Samuel stood at the edge of his own loneliness, wondering if there was any way back to the man he had once been. Arturo couldn't help but feel the sharp sting of recognition. Samuel's journey was so close to his own that it felt deliberate, as if Michael had written the character with Arturo in mind. But how could that be? Michael hadn't known what Arturo would become. He couldn't have foreseen the choices Arturo would make, the man he would turn into. Or could he? Arturo wondered if perhaps Michael had always seen the potential for this transformation, the same way he had once seen the potential for greatness in Arturo. Maybe this wasn't a prophecy so much as a warning, a reminder of what could happen to a person who lost sight of their values. The thought was both humbling and unsettling. Arturo felt as though he were standing at a crossroads, with Michael's words offering him a chance to choose a different path. But what did that path look like? Was it even possible for a man like Arturo to change? He closed the manuscript, leaning back in his chair as he stared at the ceiling. The memories of his friendship with Michael played in his mind like an old film, flickering and faded but still vivid in its emotional impact. He thought of the afternoons they had spent in the library, the way Michael's eyes lit up when he talked about the stories he wanted to write. Arturo's chest tightened as he recalled Michael's unwavering belief in the power of stories. "They're like bridges," Michael had said once, his voice full of conviction. "They connect people. They help us understand each other." At the time, Arturo had dismissed the sentiment as naive. But now, after reading A Promise Lost, he understood what Michael had meant. The manuscript had reached across time, across death itself, to deliver a message Arturo couldn't ignore. Arturo stood and began to pace the room, his thoughts swirling like the snow outside. He felt restless, as if the emotions stirred by the manuscript were too big to contain. His mind returned to the gala, the event he had been so eager to avoid. It wasn't just a party, it was a reflection of everything Arturo had built, everything Michael's words now called into question. For years, Arturo had treated the gala as a display of power, a chance to remind his employees and competitors alike that he was at the top of his game. But what if it could be something else? What if it could be an opportunity to make amends, to start a new chapter? The thought lingered, pulling at him. Arturo walked to the window, gazing out at the city below. The snow-covered streets glittered under the glow of Christmas lights, and he could see faint silhouettes of people rushing to finish their holiday preparations. The world seemed alive with possibility, a stark contrast to the stillness of his penthouse. Arturo returned to the desk, picking up the manuscript again. He flipped to the final chapter, curious to see how Michael had chosen to end Samuel's story. The words that followed were both devastating and hopeful. Samuel, broken and alone, found himself confronted by a stranger who reminded him of the man he had once been. Through their conversation, Samuel began to see a path forward, not one of easy redemption, but of small, deliberate choices to rebuild the connections he had lost. The ending wasn't tidy or perfect, but it was honest. Samuel didn't emerge unscathed, but he emerged willing to try, to change, to be better. Arturo felt a lump rise in his throat as he closed the manuscript. Michael's words were clear: redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about acknowledging it and choosing to do better in the present. Arturo glanced at his phone again, then back at the manuscript. The decision that had been forming in the back of his mind now crystallized into something undeniable. He would go to the gala, but not as the man his employees expected. He wouldn't deliver the polished, detached speech he had prepared, full of empty platitudes about success and growth. Instead, he would tell them the truth, about Michael, about the manuscript, about the man he had been and the man he hoped to become. It was a terrifying thought, exposing himself in such a vulnerable way. Arturo had spent years building walls to protect his image, his reputation, his carefully constructed empire. But Michael's words had shown him that those walls had also trapped him, cutting him off from the very things that gave life meaning. Arturo took a deep breath, the weight in his chest shifting from dread to determination. He looked at the manuscript one last time, running his fingers over the worn cover. "All right, Michael," he murmured, his voice low but steady. "Let's do this." The snow outside continued to fall as Arturo prepared to leave. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in far too long: hope. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel was a glittering spectacle, alive with the hum of conversation, the clink of champagne glasses, and the soft notes of a string quartet. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the crowd, reflecting off gold accents and ornate holiday decorations. A towering Christmas tree stood near the entrance, adorned with shimmering ornaments and ribbons of red and gold. It was the kind of event Arturo had attended countless times before, yet tonight, everything felt different. He stood in the shadows near the entrance, unnoticed by the crowd, holding Michael's manuscript in one hand. The weight of it felt heavier than ever, as though it carried not just the words of his old friend, but the responsibility of his own redemption. Arturo adjusted his tie and took a deep breath. The usual confidence he exuded at these events was absent, replaced by a gnawing sense of vulnerability. For years, these galas had been opportunities to showcase his success, to revel in the admiration of his employees and colleagues. Tonight, he wasn't here for admiration. He was here to confront the man he had become. As he stepped into the ballroom, heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Arturo De Luca rarely arrived at these events on time, let alone made a quiet entrance. His presence usually commanded attention, his tailored suits and calculated charm serving as an extension of his authority. But tonight, there was no bravado, no calculated charm, only a man carrying a manuscript and wearing an expression that seemed far from celebratory. "Mr. De Luca," a voice called out. His assistant, Clara, approached with a mixture of relief and confusion. "We weren't sure you'd make it. The staff has been asking about you." "I'm here now," Arturo said, his voice steady but devoid of its usual sharpness. "Clara, do me a favor. Find out when the speeches are scheduled to begin. I'll need the microphone." Clara blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Of course, but, is everything all right?" Arturo met her gaze, and for a moment, she saw something in his eyes she didn't recognize, regret, perhaps, or vulnerability. "It will be," he said quietly. Clara nodded and hurried off to make the arrangements. Arturo took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, though he had no intention of drinking it. He moved through the crowd, nodding politely at familiar faces but avoiding prolonged conversations. The employees who dared approach him quickly noticed his subdued demeanor and hesitated, unsure how to proceed. At the center of the room, a large stage had been set up for the evening speeches. A podium stood beneath a banner that read De Luca Publishing, celebrating a year of success. Arturo stared at it from a distance, his grip tightening on the manuscript. For years, that podium had been his throne, a place where he delivered rehearsed speeches about growth, profits, and the company's dominance in the publishing world. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose. The string quartet finished their piece, and the room broke into polite applause. Arturo saw Clara gesturing to him from the side of the stage. The time had come that he made his way to the front of the room, each step feeling heavier than the last. As he climbed the steps to the stage, the chatter in the ballroom faded into an expectant silence. All eyes were on him now, the weight of their attention pressing down like a spotlight. Arturo placed the manuscript on the podium, letting his hands rest on it for a moment. He looked out at the crowd, his employees, his peers, people who had spent years either admiring or fearing him. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady but lacking its usual commanding tone. "I'll admit, I wasn't sure I'd attend tonight. But as I stand here, I realize this moment is more important than I imagined." The room was silent, the audience waiting for the polished, motivational speech they had come to expect. Instead, Arturo's words carried an unexpected weight. "For years," he continued, "I've stood on this stage and talked about success. About profits, growth, and all the ways we've solidified our place in this industry. But tonight, I want to talk about something else, about promises, about the power of stories, and about redemption." A murmur ran through the crowd, but Arturo pressed on. "Many of you know me as a man who built this company from the ground up. What you don't know is that I didn't do it alone. There was someone who inspired me, someone who believed in the power of stories long before I understood what they could mean." Arturo picked up the manuscript and held it up for the crowd to see. "This is a promise lost, a manuscript written by my best friend, Michael Hayes. He passed away years ago, but before he did, he wrote this story, a story that found its way back to me only yesterday. The room was utterly silent now, the weight of Arturo's words hanging in the air. Michael and I grew up together, Arturo said, his voice softer now. We shared a love of stories, and we made promises to each other about the futures we wanted to build. But as I climbed the ladder of success, I forgot those promises. I forgot what mattered. And in doing so, I lost a part of myself. He paused, taking a breath as he fought to steady his emotions. This manuscript is more than just a story, he continued. It's a reminder. Michael's words speak of faith, love, and the importance of keeping our promises, even when it's difficult, even when the world tells us it doesn't matter. Arturo looked out at the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces before him. For too long, I've let this company reflect my own shortcomings. I've allowed ambition to overshadow empathy, and I've prioritized profits over people. That changes tonight. A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. Starting in the new year, A Promise Lost will be the first book we publish, Arturo said firmly. Every cent of its profits will be donated to organizations that support education, creativity, and literacy, values Michael held dear. The crowd erupted into applause, but Arturo held up a hand to quiet them. And that's not all. I've realized that I owe more than just a promise to Michael. I owe a promise to all of you, to make this company a place where stories are valued, where employees are respected, and where we remember why we fell in love with publishing in the first place. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Arturo barely heard it. He stepped back from the podium, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over him. For the first time in years, he had spoken not as the man people expected him to be, but as the man he wanted to become. As he descended the stage, Clara approached him, her expression a mixture of astonishment and admiration. That was unexpected, she said. Arturo gave her a faint smile. It was overdue. The night continued, the mood in the ballroom transformed by Arturo's speech. For the first time in years, Arturo didn't feel like a stranger in his own company. As he mingled with the crowd, he saw something he hadn't seen in a long time, genuine warmth, not the fear or guarded admiration he had grown used to, and as the clock inched closer to midnight, Arturo realized he had taken the first step towards something he hadn't dared hope for in years: redemption. The ballroom had shifted. What had begun as another glamorous event steeped in formalities now felt alive with something deeper. Arturo's speech lingered in the air like a charge, electrifying the room with a rare sense of sincerity. Conversations buzzed, employees and guests exchanging whispers about the transformation they had just witnessed. Arturo, always the untouchable figurehead, had cracked open a window into his soul, revealing a vulnerability no one had anticipated. Arturo stood off to the side, the manuscript still in hand. He had spoken the words he needed to, but the weight of what he had done hadn't fully settled. He felt exposed in a way that was unfamiliar and unsettling. Yet, beneath the unease, there was a flicker of something else: relief. He had carried the burden of unspoken truths for so long that finally voicing them felt like releasing a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Clara appeared beside him, her usual air of brisk efficiency softened by a rare smile. "You know, I don't think I've ever seen the staff this excited after one of these galas," she said. Arturo raised an eyebrow. "Excited?" "They're inspired, Arturo," she said, the use of his first name a subtle acknowledgement of the shift between them. "You gave them something they weren't expecting tonight, something real." Arturo glanced around the room, watching as employees he had once considered little more than names on a payroll gathered in animated groups, their faces alight with enthusiasm. It was a stark contrast to the restrained atmosphere that usually marked these events. "I wasn't trying to inspire anyone," Arturo said quietly. I needed to say it." "Well, it worked," Clara replied. "I've never seen them look at you like this." Arturo followed her gaze and noticed several employees glancing his way, their expressions a mix of curiosity and something he couldn't quite name. Respect, perhaps, but also hope. It was unsettling, but not unwelcome. As the evening wore on, Arturo found himself drawn into conversations he hadn't anticipated. Employees approached him, some cautiously, others with an eagerness that caught him off guard. "Mr. DeLuca," said a young woman, holding out her hand nervously. "I just wanted to say thank you for what you said tonight. It means a lot to hear you talk about valuing stories like that. It's why I wanted to work here in the first place." Arturo shook her hand, the sincerity in her voice disarming him. "Thank you," he said. "And please, call me Arturo." The woman smiled, her tension easing. "Arturo. Thank you for reminding us why we're here." As she walked away, Arturo felt a pang of guilt. How long had it been since his employees had felt that kind of passion for their work? How long had it been since he had, the night continued, the energy in the room building toward the inevitable countdown to midnight. Arturo moved through the crowd, engaging in conversations that felt surprisingly natural, even for someone who had spent years mastering the art of networking. But this was different. These weren't calculated exchanges meant to solidify business relationships. They were genuine moments of connection, and for the first time in years, Arturo felt like he was part of something larger than himself. As the clock neared 11:30, Arturo found himself standing near the towering Christmas tree at the edge of the ballroom. The lights twinkled against the reflective glass ornaments, casting warm patterns on the floor. Arturo looked up at the star perched atop the tree, his thoughts drifting. It wasn't just about the manuscript anymore. Michael's words had forced him to confront the life he had built, but they had also planted a seed of something he hadn't felt in years, a desire to do better, not just for Michael's memory, but for himself and everyone around him. "Thinking of adding decorator to your resume?" Arturo turned to see Clara standing nearby, her arms crossed but her expression light. "I'm just thinking," he said, his voice trailing off. "Well, whatever you're thinking, you've got an audience," she said, nodding toward the stage. Arturo followed her gaze and saw a small group of employees gathering near the podium. Someone had picked up a microphone and was calling for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we approach midnight, it's time for the traditional toast," the man announced, his voice carrying over the crowd. "And who better to lead us this year than the man who just gave us the speech of a lifetime, Arturo DeLuca." The room erupted into applause, and Arturo froze. He hadn't anticipated this. Giving a prepared speech was one thing, but leading the final toast, an unplanned moment that demanded spontaneity and heart, was entirely different. Clara nudged him gently. "You're up." Arturo hesitated, then took a deep breath. He made his way to the stage, the manuscript still clutched in his hand. As he stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent once again, all eyes on him. He placed the manuscript down, letting his hands rest on either side of the podium. "I'm not sure I deserve another turn at the mic," he began, a ripple of laughter breaking the tension. "But since you've all been kind enough to indulge me, I'll keep this brief." Arturo glanced down at the manuscript, drawing strength from its presence. "Tonight isn't just about celebrating the success of this company," he said. "It's about celebrating the people who make it possible. Each of you brings something unique to this place, something valuable. And if there's one thing I've learned tonight, it's that I haven't done enough to honor that." The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. Arturo paused, then continued. "This manuscript," he said, holding it up, "is a reminder of what stories can do. They connect us. They teach us. They remind us of who we are and who we can be. And as we move into the new year, I want this company to reflect those values, not just in the stories we publish, but in the way we treat each other." He raised his glass, his voice steady and clear. "To Michael Hayes, who reminded me of the promises worth keeping. To all of you, who make this company more than just a name. And to the stories we have yet to tell. Happy New Year." The room erupted into cheers, the sound filling the ballroom as glasses clinked and voices rose in celebration. Arturo stepped back from the podium, feeling a swell of emotions he couldn't quite name. As the countdown began, Arturo stood by the edge of the stage, watching as the room transformed into a scene of joy and connection. When the clock struck midnight and the crowd erupted into shouts of "Happy New Year," Arturo glanced at the manuscript one last time. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of clarity, as if the fog that had surrounded him for so long had finally lifted. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be worth it. Michael's words had found their way back to him, and now, it was his turn to honor them. The following days were unlike any Arturo had experienced in years. The morning after the gala, he arrived at the office earlier than anyone expected, carrying Michael's manuscript under his arm. The staff, still buzzing from the previous night, whispered as he passed, their usual wary glances replaced with something softer, curiosity, perhaps even respect. Arturo made his way to the executive conference room, where the morning's editorial meeting was already underway. It was a routine gathering, meant to discuss upcoming releases and the company's priorities for the new quarter. Normally, Arturo's presence at these meetings was rare and intimidating. Today, it was entirely different. He entered the room quietly, placing the manuscript on the table as he took a seat at the head. The room fell silent, the editorial team exchanging uncertain looks. Arturo cleared his throat, leaning forward with his hands clasped. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady but uncharacteristically warm. "I know I'm not usually a part of these meetings, but today is different. There's something important I'd like to discuss." The team shifted in their seats, clearly bracing for the unexpected. Arturo picked up the manuscript and held it aloft. "This," he said, "is A Promise Lost, a manuscript written by Michael Hayes. Some of you may have heard me mention it last night at the gala. Michael was a close friend, someone who believed in the power of stories in a way that few people do. And this story, it's extraordinary." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I want this to be the first book we publish in the new year," he continued. "But not just publish. I want us to treat this project as more than a release date or a marketing campaign. I want it to be a statement of who we are and what this company stands for moving forward." The room was silent, the editorial team processing what Arturo was saying. One of the senior editors, a woman named Elaine who had worked at DeLuca Publishing for over a decade, finally spoke up. "Arturo," she said carefully, "this sounds like a deeply personal project. But, are you sure this is the right direction for the company? It's a departure from our usual approach." Arturo met her gaze, his expression firm but understanding. "That's exactly why it's the right direction, Elaine. For too long, we've focused on what's safe, what's guaranteed to sell. But stories aren't supposed to be safe. They're supposed to matter. Michael's story matters. And I believe it can remind us all of why we're here." The room fell silent again, but this time, there was no resistance in the air, only contemplation. Arturo could see the gears turning in their minds, the shift beginning to take root. Elaine nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "Let's make it happen." The decision marked the beginning of a transformation, not just for the company, but for Arturo himself. Over the next few weeks, Arturo immersed himself in the process of bringing A Promise Lost to life. For the first time in years, he attended every meeting, not as a distant CEO dictating decisions, but as an active participant. He worked closely with the editorial team, offering input but also listening in a way he hadn't before. He sought out feedback from younger editors, valuing their perspectives instead of dismissing them. He even spent time with the marketing team, brainstorming ways to convey the heart of the story to readers. The staff quickly noticed the change. Arturo, once an intimidating and often aloof figure, was now approachable, even collaborative. Employees who had once avoided him in the hallways found themselves engaging in impromptu conversations, surprised by his genuine interest in their work. But the transformation wasn't limited to the office. Arturo began to reach out to people he had neglected over the years, former colleagues, estranged friends, even distant family members. The manuscript had awakened something in him, a realization that relationships were the true currency of life, not the profits he had so long pursued. One of those calls was to Michael's younger sister, Anna, whom Arturo hadn't spoken to since Michael's funeral. She answered cautiously, her tone hesitant. "Arturo," she said. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you." "I know," Arturo replied, his voice tinged with guilt. And I'm sorry for that. I should have reached out years ago. But there's something I need to tell you. He explained how the manuscript had found its way to him, how Michael's words had forced him to confront his past, and how he planned to honor his friend by publishing the story. Anna was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. Michael always believed in you, Arturo, she said. Even when you two drifted apart, he never doubted that you'd find your way back to what mattered. Thank you for doing this, for him. The conversation stayed with Arturo, a reminder of the many bridges he still had a chance to rebuild. As the release date for A Promise Lost drew closer, the company began to shift in ways that went beyond a single book. Arturo's new approach to leadership trickled down through the ranks, inspiring others to embrace creativity and collaboration. The office, once a place of tension and quiet resentment, began to buzz with energy and optimism. Employees who had once feared Arturo now found themselves seeking his advice, not because they had to, but because they valued his perspective. Arturo, in turn, discovered a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, Clara stopped by his office, a stack of papers in hand. She hesitated at the door, glancing at him as if weighing her words. Can I say something, Arturo? She asked. Of course, he replied, setting aside the report he had been reviewing. You've changed, she said simply. And I don't mean just at work. I mean, you're different. In a good way. Arturo smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. I think Michael's manuscript has a lot to do with that. Clara nodded. Maybe. But you were the one who decided to act on it. That's not easy to do. Her words stayed with him as the day turned to evening. Arturo found himself thinking about the person he had been, the choices he had made, and the man he was becoming. The transformation wasn't complete, he knew that. Redemption wasn't a finish line, it was a daily choice, a commitment to be better than the day before. That night, as he left the office, Arturo passed by the break room and noticed a group of employees laughing and chatting over coffee. They greeted him warmly, inviting him to join them. For the first time in years, Arturo accepted, and as he sat among them, sharing stories and laughter, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of belonging. The crisp winter air carried the hum of anticipation as Arturo walked through the doors of the small, independent bookstore that had been chosen to host the launch of A Promise Lost. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the scent of paper and ink, filling the cozy space with warmth. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily to the ground, blanketing the streets in a soft white glow that seemed almost poetic, as if the city itself were marking the occasion. Arturo stood in the entrance for a moment, taking it all in. The store was bustling with life, readers flipping through books, staff arranging the display table that featured stacks of A Promise Lost, and a quiet murmur of voices that blended into the ambient hum of a jazz melody playing softly in the background. This wasn't like the sleek, corporate events Arturo was used to. There were no grand stages, no glittering chandeliers or flashing cameras. Instead, there was an intimacy to the scene that felt right, a fitting tribute to Michael's work. Arturo tightened his grip on the worn manuscript tucked under his arm, the original pages now encased in a protective folder, and moved further into the room. The weeks leading up to this moment had been transformative in ways Arturo hadn't expected. The process of preparing A Promise Lost for publication had forced him to immerse himself in every detail, not just as a CEO but as someone deeply invested in the story. He had worked with the editorial team to preserve Michael's voice, rejecting any suggestion of alterations that might dilute the manuscript's heart. Arturo had also taken an active role in the marketing campaign, though his approach had been different from his usual strategy. Instead of relying on flashy slogans or celebrity endorsements, the campaign focused on authenticity. The story of Michael Hayes and his friendship with Arturo became the cornerstone of the messaging, a tale of promises, redemption, and the enduring power of storytelling. To Arturo's surprise, the response had been overwhelming. Readers were captivated by the story before the book even hit shelves. Advance copies sent to literary critics garnered glowing reviews, with many praising the raw honesty and emotional depth of the narrative. But for Arturo, the most meaningful moments came in the quiet hours he spent revisiting the manuscript. Each reading brought new layers of understanding, not just of Michael's words but of his own journey. The book had become more than a tribute to a lost friend, it was a guide, a compass pointing Arturo toward the man he wanted to be. Now, standing in the bookstore as the evening's event began to take shape, Arturo felt a mixture of pride and humility. This wasn't just Michael's moment, it was a testament to the connection they had shared and the promise Arturo was finally fulfilling. Arturo, Clara's voice broke through his thoughts. She approached with a clipboard in hand, her ever-efficient demeanor softened by a genuine smile. The crowd starting to gather. You ready? Arturo glanced at the growing group of people near the seating area, their eyes scanning the shelves or chatting excitedly among themselves. Some held copies of A Promise Lost, the cover art, a minimalist design featuring a single tree standing in a field of snow, catching the light. As ready as I'll ever be, Arturo said, his smile tinged with nervous energy. Clara nodded approvingly. Good. Just remember, this isn't about being the CEO. It's about being yourself. Arturo chuckled softly. You make it sound so simple. It is, Clara replied. You just have to believe it. The event began with a brief introduction from Elaine, one of the senior editors who had been instrumental in bringing A Promise Lost to life. She spoke about the significance of the book, its journey from manuscript to publication, and the vision behind its release. Then it was Arturo's turn. As he stepped to the small podium at the front of the room, the murmur of voices quieted, all eyes turning toward him. For a moment, he hesitated, the weight of the manuscript in his hand grounding him. Good evening, he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. Thank you all for being here tonight. This is a moment I've been waiting for, and dreading, for a long time. Not because I'm nervous to speak, though I'd be lying if I said I wasn't, but because this book, A Promise Lost, is more than just a story to me. It's a bridge to someone I lost too soon. The audience was silent, their attention rapt. Arturo took a breath, continuing, Michael Hayes was my best friend, my confidant, and my partner in dreaming big when we were kids. He believed in the power of stories, not just to entertain, but to connect, to heal, to inspire. And while I went on to build a career in publishing, Michael stayed true to his passion for writing, even when it wasn't easy. This book is his legacy, a reflection of his heart and soul. It's also a reminder of a promise I made to him a long time ago, a promise I failed to keep, until now. Arturo's voice faltered slightly, but he pressed on, the vulnerability in his tone only adding to the sincerity of his words. A Promise Lost isn't just a story about redemption, it's a story of hope, of second chances, and of the courage it takes to face ourselves and choose to be better. And I can't think of a better time to share it with the world than now, when so many of us are searching for connection and meaning. He held up the manuscript, the original pages that had once been entrusted to him in Michael's letter. This is where it began, he said. And now, thanks to all of you, our editors, our marketers, our readers, it has the chance to reach hearts and minds far beyond what Michael and I could have ever imagined. The room erupted into applause, the sound washing over Arturo like a wave. He stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding but full. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of handshakes, conversations, and the signing of books. Arturo listened intently as readers shared their impressions of the story, their voices filled with gratitude and emotion. One moment stood out above the rest. A young man approached Arturo, holding a copy of the book with trembling hands. Mr. De Luca, he said, his voice unsteady. I just wanted to say thank you. This book, it feels like it was written for me. I've made mistakes, hurt people I care about, and it's been hard to see a way forward. But Michael's story, it gives me hope. Arturo felt a lump rise in his throat. He placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, meeting his gaze. The fact that you're here, ready to take that step, that's already something, Arturo said. Don't give up on yourself. As the young man walked away, Arturo realized something profound. Michael's words weren't just a gift to him, they were a gift to everyone who read them. By the end of the evening, Arturo stood near the door, watching as the last of the guests filtered out into the snowy night. He felt lighter than he had in years, as if a part of himself that had been missing had finally come home. The launch of A Promise Lost was more than the culmination of a project. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where promises were honored, stories were cherished, and the man Arturo had once been was rediscovered. The first rays of sunlight broke over Chicago, painting the snow-covered city in hues of gold and pink. Arturo sat in his penthouse, a steaming cup of coffee resting on the glass table in front of him. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the city waking below, but his thoughts were anything but still. The launch of A Promise Lost had been a resounding success, far beyond what Arturo could have anticipated. The bookstore event had sparked something remarkable, a wave of genuine connection between readers and the story. The following days had been a whirlwind of interviews, glowing reviews, and an outpouring of heartfelt messages from readers who had found themselves reflected in Michael's words. Arturo leaned back in his chair, holding a first-edition copy of the book in his hands. The cover, with its solitary tree standing in a snowy field, had become a symbol of resilience and redemption, much like the story itself. He traced his fingers over the title, A Promise Lost, and felt a deep sense of fulfillment, not just for honoring Michael's memory, but for rediscovering his own purpose. For years, Arturo had measured success in numbers, sales figures, market share, profit margins. But now, he understood that true success couldn't be quantified. It was in the emails he had received from readers, the conversations he'd had with employees, and the young man at the launch who had found hope in Michael's story. The manuscript had started as a haunting reminder of promises unfulfilled, but it had grown into something far greater, a bridge to a future Arturo hadn't dared to imagine. His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Clara, meeting at 10 to discuss the education initiative. "See you there." Arturo smiled. The education initiative was one of several new projects he had proposed in the wake of the book's success. All proceeds from A Promise Lost were being funneled into literacy programs, community libraries, and grants for aspiring writers. It was a small but significant step toward making the Luca Publishing a force for good, not just profit. Arturo finished his coffee and prepared for the day ahead. When he arrived at the office, the atmosphere was different from what he remembered just months ago. The tension that had once hung over the halls was gone, replaced by a sense of energy and collaboration. Employees greeted him warmly, their smiles genuine. The meeting room was already buzzing with conversation when Arturo entered. Clara and Elaine were reviewing a stack of proposals, while other team members discussed ideas for the initiative's rollout. Arturo took his seat at the head of the table, but this time, it didn't feel like a throne, it felt like a place among equals. "All right," he said, glancing around the room. "Where are we?" Clara took the lead, outlining plans for a partnership with local schools to bring creative writing workshops to underserved communities. Elaine added details about a grant program for independent bookstores, inspired by the success of the A Promise Lost launch event. As Arturo listened, he couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. This wasn't just a meeting, it was the realization of a vision he had barely dared to hope for. "Let's make it happen," he said when the discussion wrapped up. "And remember, this is just the beginning. I want us to keep thinking about how we can use our platform to create real change." The team nodded, their enthusiasm infectious. As the meeting adjourned, Clara lingered behind, her expression thoughtful. "You're doing it, you know," she said. "Doing what?" Arturo asked, raising an eyebrow. "Becoming the man you talked about in that speech," she said. "The one who values stories and people over profits." Arturo smiled, though it was tinged with humility. "It's not just me, Clara. It's all of us." She nodded, a rare softness in her usually sharp demeanor. "Still, it started with you." The day passed quickly, filled with meetings, calls, and moments of reflection. Arturo spent much of it reviewing manuscripts, something he hadn't done personally in years. It felt good to be hands-on again, to engage with the creative process rather than simply managing the business side. As evening fell, Arturo returned to his penthouse, the city lights twinkling against the darkening sky. He poured himself a glass of wine and stood by the window, looking out over the frozen expanse of Lake Michigan. The snow-covered streets below were quiet now, the chaos of the day giving way to a peaceful stillness. Arturo thought about Michael, as he often did these days. He imagined his friend's reaction to everything that had happened, the book, the changes at the company, the impact of his words on so many lives. Michael would have been proud, Arturo thought, but he also would have shrugged it off with a laugh, insisting that the credit belonged to the story itself. Arturo raised his glass, a quiet toast to the friend who had reminded him of the man he could be. "Thank you, Michael," he said softly. The following weeks brought more milestones. A Promise Lost continued to resonate with readers, climbing bestseller lists and sparking discussions about the themes of redemption, forgiveness, and the power of storytelling. Arturo's renewed focus on authenticity and connection began to permeate every aspect of the company, setting a tone that inspired others to follow suit. Employees who had once kept their heads down now spoke up with ideas and initiatives, confident that their voices would be heard. Writers who had been rejected by DeLuca Publishing in the past were given a second chance, their stories evaluated not just for their marketability but for their heart. Arturo found himself more engaged than ever, not just in his work but in his relationships. He reconnected with old friends, rebuilt bridges he had once burned, and reached out to people he had wronged in the past. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. One particularly cold afternoon, Arturo visited Michael's grave. The cemetery was quiet, the snow crunching softly under his feet as he made his way to the headstone. He stood there for a long moment, the original manuscript in his hands. "I did it," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I kept my promise. And I'll keep making sure your words reach the people who need them." He placed a small bundle of flowers on the grave, the bright red petals stark against the snow. As he turned to leave, a sense of peace settled over him. By the time spring arrived, the world around Arturo had changed, but so had the world within him. DeLuca Publishing was thriving, not just financially but emotionally, and Arturo himself felt more alive than he had in years. The lessons of A Promise Lost stayed with him, guiding his choices and reminding him of the man he wanted to be. And as he stood in his office one morning, gazing at the city bathed in sunlight, he knew that the best stories weren't the ones that ended perfectly, they were the ones that left room for growth, for hope, for second chances. Arturo smiled, ready to turn the page and begin the next chapter. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your favorite part in the comments below. Your support means so much to us. See you in the next video.